year ending in 0 in American history after the year 1789. So starting with 1790, you have what every 10 years? Just had one last year.
A census.
That's exactly right. A census. Censuses are a huge part of a developed society. If you think about, there came about in the days of Caesar Augustus, there went out a decree upon all the land, the people to be taxed. So they had to register for a census in their home place. That's why Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem to register for the census, because the Roman Empire was taking a census of every person that lived in Rome or in the Roman Empire. Well, in 1890, there was a census done. And what it showed, it was pretty remarkable, was that there was no more frontier. Now, that's not completely true, right? The idea that there was no frontier. I mean, if you've never been to Montana or Wyoming today, there's still what appears to be a frontier. But what it meant in the census was that there was no place that American people had not been in, had not settled, so to speak. And that meant that the frontier was closed. Now, there would be a historian you're going to read about in this chapter named Frederick Jackson Turner. Dr. Turner is going to write rarely do we talk about historian like professors, but he's going to write a thesis, a very famous research paper that's going to say that the closing of the frontier is a seminal, a major moment in the history of our country. And he said it's called the influence of the frontier upon history. So the big question was, first of all, I guess you would think, the narrative of American history, certainly from white people, had been westward expansion. So if there is no more West, then what does that mean as America? I.e., no more place to expand to, so to speak. Now, of course, that didn't mean there wasn't people are still moving to Denver, people are still moving to Phoenix. But the idea is that somehow there was no more sort of wild land. And that really was sort of like a shock, because when Napoleon sold us Louisiana, Americans had been told that it would take centuries, plural, to expand through all that land. You think about the over 3,000 miles across the United States. And so what happened is, less than 100 years after the purchase of Louisiana, the entire West had been settled. And that was remarkable, at least in the minds of Americans. So we'll read about Frederick Jackson Turner again, but definitely want to be familiar with this date, right? And while we're going through this, and we'll talk about it at the end, I want you to understand why the West, and I used to watch a show, I loved it, called Tombstone. My wife and I have been off and on watching a show that's set in, it's in Montana, it's in Bozeman, right? It stars Kevin Costner, and it glamorizes the West, the modern West, and it's called Yellowstone. It's really neat. So the West has this role. I mean, how many of you guys have ever heard of cowboy movies, right? Cowboys and Indians. Of course, one of the most recent Westerns was as a spin on it, and that's with Jamie Foxx playing as an African American who becomes sort of a cowboy, an outlaw, and that was a really cool movie. But the West still plays a role in American culture, the cowboy and Indian mystique. So let's move into the actual narrative of the Plains Indians. So first of all, it helps to know where the Great Plains are. So I'm talking about, if you're here, so here's the Kansas border. So remember the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? So it's in Kansas, it's really western Iowa, Kansas and Nebraska are where the Great Plains starts. So imagine kind of around in here. Now, of course, as you get further west, you get the Rocky Mountains, but really it's in this area of the 100th meridian and around this part, okay? So these are the Plains Indians, the Native Americans who were not the Seminoles, for example, or the Creek or the Cherokee. But if you do some math, it's really fascinating. You guys remember we had Native Americans in Virginia, like right here, right? And they're, the Native Americans that were Powhatan were called the Algonquin because of the language they spoke. But the Occaneechi, the Saponi, and the Tutelo were the three major tribes right here. Y'all know Bugs Island? That used to be called Occaneechi Island. Okay. There's a park right there in Halifax County called Occaneechi State Park, right? Up here on the Stanton River, it used to be the Saponi River. Okay, which is the tribe there. The community in Pennsylvania County called Bearskin is named after a Saponi-speaking guy who helped William Byrd. The Indian name was Bearskin. So they spoke Sioux. They spoke the Sioux language. And this is their ancestors, or their descendants, rather, because they got driven out of Virginia. And 200 years later, they're on the Great Plains. So I find that really fascinating that the people that are the Plains Indians that are riding horses used to be the Woodland Village Indians of right here. And they first were driven out and they went up to Pennsylvania, New York, where the Iroquois Confederacy was. And they went up into Canada and then they came down where Minnesota is. So if you're thinking about right here, right, this was kind of like where our Indians ended up in the Dakotas, at least Virginia's Indians, if you want to think of it that way. But what happened is, and this is kind of a lengthy narrative here, but my question number 2 says, and this is not this answer, but I'm just going to explain it to you. Question number 2 says how the Plains impacted their own settlements prior to the whites. And so what happened is, if it's one of those repeating patterns of history, if you study, whenever there's contact, and that makes conflict, right? Someone gets pushed. So if you go back to the 300 ADs, the Mongols are arriving on the steppes of Asia, and they're running into German tribes like the Goths and the Vandals and the Ostrogoths, and they're pushing them into Rome, and they're the ones that defeat the Roman Empire, right? So what happens is when the Sioux get pushed out of Virginia, they end up in the Great Plains. Well, what do you think happens when they get to the Great Plains? Well, somebody lives there, and so there's conflict that's exacerbated. So the more whites move west, the more Native Americans are impacted with each other. So they end up becoming more warlike than they used to be because there's less territory. They become more conflict oriented, right? And so this is going to create a profound change in the identity of the Native American, a profound cultural change, particularly because they're going to adapt the horse, and become nomadic hunters who use rifles by this time in history to hunt the buffalo, right? And so these are buffalo hunting nomadic people. Same question for number 3. Now, there's several other actions that are going to impact the Plains Indians that whites are going to do. Most notably, and one that has the most destructive impact on the Plains Indians is the construction of the railroad. When the railroads come through, number 3, they're going to absolutely devastate hunting grounds. Buffalo herds, patterns of migration are going to be altered. And then, of course, the whites on the trains are going to slaughter the buffalo herds, which is really going to just absolutely decimate the native food population. Okay. So that obviously, mining is going to have a serious consequence. The overkilling of the buffalo. Later, they're going to put barbed wire across the plains, right? So all kinds of stuff. Got it? So lots of impacts there. But let's talk about number 4. So when we think about Native Americans today, we think about treaties and reservations. And while the Trail of Tears had created a sort of reservation, that term hadn't really been applied yet because they had called it Indian Territory. So if you looked at Oklahoma, it wasn't called Oklahoma yet. It was just called Indian Territory, and it wasn't really a reservation. But the first reservation that was really created formally is under what was called the Fort Laramie Treaty. Okay. And what it said was that all land covered by the treaty was Indian territory. Thus, this is an Indian reservation. It was reserved for the Indians. In exchange, Native Americans could not interfere with the Oregon Trail coming through it. And there would be forts in the territories in exchange for what is called an annuity. An annuity is an annual sum of money to the tribes of $50,000 for 50 years. So each year they would get $50,000. There would be a reservation agent who would oversee the distribution of food and blankets, right? And this would make a lasting, everlasting peace amongst these 8 tribes. Now, I do not expect you to learn these 8 tribes by name, right? But it's best to think of this as the Sioux lands. I'll put it that way. Like the Sioux were the most successful of these 8 tribes in terms of power. The Hidatsa and the Arikara were smaller, but you can see Arikara country here, Crow, Cheyenne, Pawnee, Hidatsa. But the very word Dakota is a variant on the word Lakota, because Sioux is a language group. You hear that? Just like I said, the Occaneechi, Saponi, and Tula were Sioux people, Sioux speaking. So all of these are Sioux people, so to speak. That makes sense. Sioux language group, even though they had different tribes. Okay, so that's the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The other 2 treaties, well, really the only other treaty I need you to know is called the Treaty of Fort Atkinson. And it is here in Oklahoma. And that's what creates what was called the Great Indian Reservation. So you had 2 reservations, the Great Sioux Reservation, which is here, and the Great Indian Reservation, which was really a collection of the 5 civilized tribes and some of the other more southern tribes. Okay, so that was supposed to be, under the reservation system, land that was forever going to belong to these 2 people, these 2 groups, right? Keep in mind, though, and the book points this out, the very word Indian itself is a misnomer. And that is because while there were occasional accounts of Native Americans forming coalitions, you guys understand what I mean by that? Like, think about when we were in New England, we were talking about the Pequot War, and then King Philip created a confederation, or the Iroquois Confederation, where you had 6 tribes ultimately that kind of worked together. That's not typical. Typically, who were ancient enemies? Tribes, right? And now they were being pushed up against each other even more. And so these rivalries are intensifying. So, I'm a big fan of the Washington Nationals. And so our division rival is the Atlanta Braves. So that's what I think of. Like, if you're a Redskin fan, your big rival is, or I'm sorry, if you're a Washington football team fan, right, irony, your big rivalry is the Cowboys, right? But that's not often who plays each other in like the Super Bowl. So there's like a bigger scenario that plays out here. And so what happens is because white people looked at Indians as like a monolith, like savages or the red man or Indians, they didn't understand that just because Red Cloud signed a treaty didn't mean all the people were agreeing to the treaty, because chiefs weren't like presidents. Chiefs weren't like kings. And so the very idea of a singular Indian culture is completely erroneous. It didn't happen. That's a misnomer. And whites really had not taken the time to be sophisticated. Many whites had not taken the time to be sophisticated students of Native Americans. They just didn't know or care. Okay, so we talked about the 2 largest reservations. You have the one in Oklahoma, which is kind of generically called the Indian Reservation, and you have the one in South Dakota primarily, which is the Sioux Reservation. So you can see it up here. See, it's a whole chunk of South Dakota, about a quarter of Nebraska, a fifth of Wyoming, and about an eighth of North Dakota. So it crosses multiple state boundaries. Keep in mind, under the reservation system, then and now, American states had no sovereignty. You understand? Like, if you were Kansas, not Kansas, I'm sorry, if you were Nebraska, you had no sovereignty in that section of your quote state. This is the issue that we ran into with Georgia when it violated the Cherokee Nation's sovereignty. Remember when it crossed up? Because what the treaties established were semi-independent countries, meaning they were independent from the states they lived in, so-called, the boundaries, but they still had to answer to the federal government. Make sense? So it's kind of like autonomous like that, almost like a territory. So know those two reservations. Now, and I want to point this out again. Another one of the treaties, it's not a treaty you have to know by name, but I would point this out, that you had treaties signed where it was supposed to represent like one tribe, like, okay, here's the Cheyenne, 6 of their chiefs, 4 Arapaho, right? But a big number, as in like a plurality, said, wait a minute, these chiefs didn't represent all the chiefs. So that's what I'm getting at, is that like just because a Cheyenne chief or a group of Cheyenne chiefs signed it didn't mean like all the Cheyenne tribes agreed to that. So there was no centralized government for Native Americans. And that's important because a lot of these treaties are going are not going to be with some of the people who resist them. You know, they're going to be like, wait a minute, we didn't sign this treaty and we don't accept the conditions of this treaty, particularly in the Sioux Nation. Okay. Now, I'm going to take this moment to point out that in the West was also, prior to the Spanish-American War, after the Civil War, the bulk of the United States Army was west of the Mississippi River. So one of the first things that happens after the Civil War is, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped number 8, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But since we're on this topic, after the Civil War, a large chunk of the Army just ceased to exist, you know, just went back to being civilians. But there was still a standing Army. That means a professional Army that was paid to, you know, take care of protection and make sure that we had defense, right? So you saw a lot of Army soldiers out west. And what's interesting, and you know, I teach this not just because it's Black History Month, but it's actually timing in that respect. A large number of the African American soldiers during the Civil War remained in the Army. So rather than leave, they stayed and were soldiers. And about 20% of the entire Army, entire armed forces really, were African American. And what's neat about these soldiers, these warriors, was that when they fought and killed and died with Native Americans, when they got scalped, tragically, their hair would be pulled off. You know, that's what happens when you get scalped, right? Native American braves or warriors would take scalps as a trophy, you know, of other warriors. We know this was not unusual. Early American Indians would wear a mohawk so that if they were defeated in battle, their enemy could pull their head off, either the scalp off. It was like a grip. They'd only shave one side of their head, and it would be, you could pull the top off. Now, the English actually exacerbated scalping as like a thing, because they would pay bounties for scalps during the French and Indian War. You know, the other enemies. So, and there's some really gruesome parts of world history and American history. For example, during the Vietnam War, there were accounts of soldiers keeping ears as trophies, like severing ears. So gruesome warfare stuff, but they considered it a sign of honor. So when they would scalp the African Americans, you know, hair, they noticed that the texture of the hair was very coarse, like the hair of a buffalo. And so that's how this group of people got the nickname the Buffalo Soldiers, you know, because of their hair that the natives thought was similar to buffalo hair, right? Now, these would be soldiers who fought like all throughout American history bravely. If you look here at these purple cannons, these were where African American troops were stationed, as well as other troops, you know, obviously. And you can see these yellow stars throughout the Great Plains. Frequently, the Buffalo Soldiers were part of the Indian Wars. A historian who's looking for precision will point out that the longest wars in American history was not the war in Afghanistan, which is what's considered the longest war in American history, not the Vietnam War, but it was the Indian Wars, meaning we fought these wars consistently for decades on decades. But we don't have, like in the West, like we as Americans don't say each war distinctively. You know, we don't define each war, so it's just kind of collectively the Indian Wars. Okay. All right. So let's get into the brutality of the so-called Indian Wars. And I'm going to point out number 8, since I skipped it. You know, one of the things the reservations created was a guarantee of being provisioned, you know, by whites. So they promised them, and I remember Red Cloud, one of the quotes is like, "Where are the good things we were promised? Right? Where are the nice blankets we were promised? Where is the fine tools we were promised?" Right? Well, what he's talking about here is the fact you guys may or may not recall that during President Grant, we had a Secretary of War named Belknap, and he was responsible for overseeing the supplies that were supposed to get to the Native Americans. But if you recall, he fleeced he stole the money basically, and so the government didn't purchase nice stuff. They gave him shoddy stuff. And so again, if you're a Native American, you're like, wait a minute, that's kind of like not what we signed up for, you know. And many Native Americans at the time were starving on the reservation. But keep in mind, it was much harder to hunt buffalo in this area when you were confined to this area, because the buffalo didn't recognize, oh, hey, we should stop here at these lines, so they were like, they didn't appreciate that. So anyway, I would remember that as a major problem. Okay. I would point out that the Buffalo soldiers, African-American soldiers, could hold the rank of non-commissioned officer. So they could be sergeants in the military. But one of their commanders is going to come back and be very, very important later, who was a white man. They had white commanders and black soldiers and like NCOs, we would say in the military. His name was John J. Pershing. And at the time, he was a general, or he's a colonel during this period. The press, now his nickname today is Black Jack Pershing. That's what we call him. But his nickname was actually given to him by reporters at the time. And he wasn't called Black Jack at the time. If you hear the name Black Jack Pershing, you think, oh, he must play cards, right? Well, his actual nickname at the time was the N-word Jack. All right. So keep in mind, if your name is John, Jack is like a four-letter word, different way to spell your name. Like John Kennedy's friends called him Jack Kennedy. All right. So Jack Pershing, John J. Pershing, was called the N-word John or Jack Pershing. And the reporters were like, we can't put that in the newspaper, and so they renamed him Black Jack. And that's where you first start to really see the word black for African American, during this period. So nonetheless, why do I point out Black Jack Pershing? He will be the commander of all our forces in World War I. So his history is coming, big. So anyway, be sure to know that. Okay. So the thing about the Native American Wars is that we look at this and, we think back about the death of, 80 million potentially Native Americans by smallpox. And people call that genocide. And I'm like, that's not, genocide is a systematic and purposeful destruction of a people. I think it's Spanish to me for all the Native Americans that died from smallpox. But what some of our generals and colonels were trying to do equates to genocide. Now, the good news is this was not federal policy. So in other words, these guys were frequently doing this sort of on their own. This was not like Grant or Hayes's policy, but it did happen. And so here's what Shivington did. So here, Sand Creek is in Colorado. Here's Sand Creek. So you can see it's right on the border with Kansas, right? There's Sand Creek. And they were, in the way. It was how the perspective was. And of course, there had been conflict between some of their braves and Shivington's men. But Shivington wanted to teach them a lesson. That's kind of the language you'll hear. And he says, darn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians. And I believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp them all, big and little. Nits make lice. That would be like baby lice. So what they did was they would pick up babies and smash their heads against rocks. They wanted to kill every one of the Indians at this massacre. And one historian writes, when white people are killed in history, it's a massacre. When Indians are killed, it's a battle. Well, we're going to make sure to make that square. This is not a battle. All right, this was a slaughter by the Americans against this group of people at Sand Creek. So I'd be familiar with this. Okay, they rode in and they slaughtered them. Here's eyewitness. And these were people who spoke to either Congress or reporters. So this is a big deal. Now, I want to go through them because the thing about it is I want to make sure you understand there are many Americans who, when they heard about this, were very, very upset. This is not what America should do. Notice the year, right? 1864. What's going on in 1864? The Civil War. So in the middle of the Civil War, not the middle, near the end of it, this happens, okay? But this was testimony. I saw the bodies of them cut to pieces, mutilated worse than any I've ever seen. Women cut to pieces, scalped, their brains knocked out, 2-month-old babies laying there. By whom were they mutilated? By the U.S., okay? So this would be terrible. It is terrible. I saw a squaw lying on her back with a broken leg. A soldier came up with a saber drawn. She raised her arm up. He broke her arm, rolled her over, raised her other arm. He broke that, and then left her without killing her. I saw one squaw cut open with an unborn child. So I want you to understand that when people are in terrible situations, they often lose their discipline. You understand? And I know right now, for example, I was thinking about this the other day. One of the great things I hope that comes out of January the 6th is that those people were recorded doing what they did, you know, breaching the Capitol, pushing, beating up cops. So people, the FBI is going after them, right? So I want that message to be clear. Like, if you are unhappy with the outcome of an election, this is not acceptable behavior. You will go to prison, okay? Because it's wrong. It's immoral, you know, to do what you did. Well, this was terrible. So you would think like we would hold them accountable, right? No. So now they had testimony and stuff, but ultimately they're like, oh, it's part of war. Okay. So this is pretty bad stuff. But, you know, here you have another major, keep that in mind. That's another military officer. There was one little child, maybe 3 years old. The Indians had gone ahead. The little child was trying to keep up. The little fellow was totally naked. Saw one man get off his horse and draw up his rifle and fire at the child. Another man said, let me try to hit the son of a, you know what? I can hit him. He got down off his horse, kneeled down and fired, and he missed. A third man came, fired, and shot the little kid. All right. You know, so I teach this also to point out that just by being Americans doesn't mean we're immune from being capable of doing terrible things. You understand? Like, don't assume that that creates sort of an insularity that you can't do bad stuff. Here you can see another one talking about people being killed. And here is another one. This was an interesting one because this guy is angry. This is the explorer, Kit Carson. Just to think of that dog Chivington and his dirty hounds up there at Sand Creek. These men shot down squaws and blew the brains out of children. You call such soldiers Christians and Indians savages? Where do you suppose our Heavenly Father, who made them both, thinks of this? Tell you what, I don't like a hostile redskin any more than you do. And when they are hostile, I fought them hard as any man, but I've never yet drawn a bead on a squaw or a papoose, and I despise a man who would. So Americans knew it was wrong. You understand? Well, there's going to be retribution, okay? Retribution by the Sioux. And so two of the most important Sioux leaders are Red Cloud, who will later surrender, and Crazy Horse, who will be engaged in another one of the big battles of history. So they are going to, on the, it's called the Bozeman Trail. The Bozeman Trail is here through Montana, right? So here you see Wyoming, and it says Fetterman Massacre. So this is not a battle either. This group of warriors, 80, well, it's more than 80, hundreds and hundreds of Cheyenne soldiers, warriors. This guy, Fetterman, the officer named Fetterman, said he wanted to go out and kill or fight Indians because of what, you know, that they were doing in the area. And at the fort, they're like, "No, man, you don't want to do that. You don't want to take a group of people out against the Cheyenne who outnumber you and are like really skilled warriors." And so this guy foolishly is going to lead 80 of his men out, and they are going to be slaughtered by the Sioux and the Cheyenne. So 80 American soldiers are just massacred to the man. So yes, there's atrocities on both sides, no doubt. You know, they're going to be scalped and killed in brutal fashion, stripped naked. They'll be like American soldiers with arrows sticking out of them, and it's just really brutal fighting. So yeah, I would know the Fetterman Massacre as well, the massacre of American soldiers. So you've had the Chivington Massacre or Sand Creek, and now you've got that. So it becomes pretty clear that they needed to find, like, make better this territory, because the Sioux within it were the dominant power, and they didn't like sharing it with everybody else. You understand? So the Sioux meet and form another treaty, which is the second Treaty of Fort Laramie. Okay, and this is a more sort of formal treaty, because if you look at this treaty, and it really is neat to me, what do each Native American get? 160 acres. You get a homestead. That's what the Homestead Act created, right? 160 acres. And the government will build all this stuff, as well as the Indian Agency. Okay, so this new Treaty of Fort Laramie is a much more specific treaty with lots more promised, I guess is the best way to put it. It also more formally establishes what the Great Sioux Reservation is. Now, this part that says unceded means these guys don't give up their land claims to go into this. Okay? So, and you can see here's a transcontinental railroad running right through this part. And that's where fighting takes place, right here. And right up here is the site of the Fetterman Massacre. So they're fighting where Americans are inside of the territory they claim was part of, let me take you back, part of this treaty. So you remember how this territory right here was? They're arguing that treaty is being violated in this territory, okay? But the Sioux Treaty is formalized. And so here's the Sioux, and you can see it's basically half of South Dakota. And right here is the crucial component. If you can see it, it says Black Hills. So right here in the sort of southwestern side of South Dakota, right at the southwest of the Sioux Reservation. What is found in the Black Hills? Gold. That's found in Indian territory, right? There's two treaties now that formalize this as Indian territory. But one of the things the Indians had to allow were scientific experiments, scientific discovery in their territory. So scientific turned out to be gold discovery. And that is going to bring a massive influx of people who are squatting in Indian territory. Most notably, and this was an HBO series, it's a really cool series, really good, called Deadwood. So Deadwood is a mining town right here in the Sioux Reservation. It's like up here, above that river, I think. So it's in this area. Okay. So what happens then is people start pouring in to these mining towns. Most notably here is Wild Bill Hickok, who had already made a name for himself as a guy who killed people and law enforcement. And he'll be sitting at here he is sitting playing cards, and he had insulted a man earlier, and the guy, like an utter coward, will walk up and shoot him in the back. Now, he was playing a hand of poker. That hand will be laid down, in the mayhem of him getting shot in the head. When they picked the hand up, this is the hand he was holding. Ace, the black aces and the black eights. So that's the dead man's hand, they call it, aces and eights. So if you ever playing poker and somebody's like, I got the dead man's hand, that's the all black aces and eights. So ace of spades, ace of clubs, eight of spades, eight of clubs. And so that's a good hand, it's two pair. But he's killed. And this is a situation where, tragically, this was very common. So they were looking for law and order, and that means they wanted the presence of the U.S. government, right? Well, they're not supposed to do that, though. They're in the reservation. So the government sends out this guy and his regiment, which is the 7th Cavalry. Now, General George Armstrong Custer had done very well in the American Civil War, but it kind of went to his head. This is one of the most arrogant, foolish leaders we have had in the history of the West, meaning his early success has made him feel sort of reckless. That's how I would describe it. He was reckless, And so what he will do is take a unit with about 270 guys, 270, all right, and he will march them against about 3,000 highly successful trained Sioux Indians. So here you see Custer coming in, right? And he reaches the Little Bighorn River, where a huge Sioux encampment is. I'm talking about a massive encampment on the Bighorn River. And he then launches an attack foolishly, all right? And that means he gets encircled, right? Like Sitting Bull's Sioux warriors encircle the entire 7th Cavalry and kill them all. You understand? This is one of the worst massacres or deaths. And it was a battle. I mean, they're shooting. It's not like they just went out to slaughter them. But they are going to be, utterly annihilated, and the 7th Cav will be wiped out. Custer will be killed at this. They will strip them naked. They'll scalp them. I mean, it's just a really bloody, terrible moment in the Sioux Wars, right? So the Battle of Little Bighorn is sometimes called Custer's Last Stand, as obviously it is. And it was really the most significant Sioux War event. Now, I point this out because Sitting Bull did not cede this territory, did not join this. Red Cloud did. So if you go back to this guy, Red Cloud, he's actually going to accept this treaty and go live on the reservation. Okay, Sitting Bull didn't. In fact, he said Red Cloud is a woman who's been, taken by the white man. All right, so to speak. So he gets critical of that. So if you look at where the Little Bighorn is, that is outside of any of the claimed territory, right? But that's because Sitting Bull does not accept that. He doesn't accept any of that as non-Indian territory. And he wants to be able to hunt wherever he wants to be able to hunt. So that ends very badly. So out of that, so if you look at the date, that's 76. So out of this comes a very famous Union general, all right, whose name was Philip Sheridan. Phil Sheridan was the general who destroyed the Shenandoah River Valley during the Civil War. He was best buddies with William Tecumseh Sherman. Remember that name? So Sherman and Sheridan are from the same sort of mindset. Keep in mind, this is not what General Grant wanted, or President Grant wanted. And this is not really what Rutherford Hayes wants. This is what he says. General Sheridan, because they're asking about passing laws to prohibit against buffalo hunting. They're considering that because they know that Colorado was going to lose all its buffalo. The white people were just slaughtering the buffalo. They're just killing all of them. This is what Sheridan said. When he heard a bill in Texas for the protection of buffalo, he said, instead of stopping the hunters, they ought to give them a vote of thanks. These men will do more in a year to settle the Indian question. That's kind of scary when you read that. Anybody know what Hitler used to say about the Jews? The Jewish question. The settlement for the Jewish question was a final solution, right? So how to settle this Indian problem? The best way to do it is destroy the Indians' food bank. A commissary is like a cafeteria. What was the buffalo? It was their meal. Kill all the buffalo, dead Indians. Survival of the fittest. So let that be a reminiscent of what other mindset was going on in America at that time, which was social Darwinism, right? Indians were seen as inferior people. They had to assimilate and become like white people, or they had to go. All right. And don't moralize about it. Too late to moralize. It has to be done. It's either us or them. So that's what you saw happen. Buffalo were slaughtered. Now, the railroads would pay guys like Buffalo Bill and others, Annie Oakley, to just ride on the trains and as they went by, shoot the buffalo. Because the buffalo were obnoxious to them. The buffalo were like deer are to us. They got in the road. How many times have you ridden down a Pennsylvania County road and almost slammed into a deer? Well, that's everywhere you went in the Great Plains were buffalo. And so they were a pain in the way of the railroads. And if you hit a buffalo stampede, it could actually derail a train. You don't want that to happen. But then the buffalo hide and the buffalo tongue had become two valuable things. Buffalo hides made wonderfully warm, like big coats, like heavy coats. And so, like if you were going to be out in the Great Plains and you had a buffalo skin coat, you were going to get cold. They also made for good like blankets, like you could lay them on the ground. They're very big and warm. So buffalo, oh, by the way, they would also use it and strip it and the hair off, like boil the hair off of it and make leather out of it. So all the leather for belts and the industrial, think about industrial belts. They were made out of buffalo straps. And then the tongue was eaten. It was a delicacy. Like people would eat buffalo tongue. People would still eat cow tongue. Yeah, it sounds gross, I know, but people liked it. So the buffalo were being slaughtered, but then the meat of the buffalo would be just left there to rot. Okay? And see, the Native American made use of every aspect of the buffalo. Their bladder would be used as like, they would carry like water in it. They would actually carry the water in bladders of they would use their fine bones for needles. So they use everything, every bit of the buffalo from start to finish. And they even consider the buffalo sacred, right? So this meant, that the Indian is probably going to get wiped out. Now, one of the last tribes was the Nez Perce tribe. Now, it's pronounced Nez Perce or Nez Perce, but it's really Nez Perce. It means pierced nose. That's literally what the French had named these natives, the Nez Perce or Nez Perce. And they were in what is modern day Idaho and eastern Oregon. And their intention, Chief Joseph's intention, was to meet up with Sitting Bull in Canada. The Canadians were much less settled in Alberta. And so if you're in British Columbia, the next province over is Alberta, and then Saskatchewan. Well, Alberta and Saskatchewan are like even now almost unsettled, right? So they were going to run up into Canada, but he was stopped. There was a battle that stopped him, and he has to surrender. He says, "From here I stand, I will fight no more forever." So Chief Joseph will not hook up with the Sioux, but rather be stuck on a reservation. Okay. Now, there were other Indians in the Southwest. And so I would shift to the Southwest, to Arizona and New Mexico. Not the Great Plains, but still a very proud group of people. You may remember the Pueblo from the very beginning of our class. These were relatives to them, and they were called the Apache. And their most famous leader is this man, Geronimo. And Geronimo, at the end of his life, said, "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man standing." You know, but Geronimo will ultimately surrender after a brutal war in New Mexico and Arizona. And when he does, he'll become like a you guys remember the circus shows, the Wild West shows? Geronimo will be like that, almost like a zoo animal, like on display. Him and Sitting Bull both will have tourists come and look at them for a while to make money off. I mean, what else are you going to do? You're an 80-year-old Indian. You know, you don't have any income. You don't have any livelihood. So this guy fought like spectacularly, but in the end, he was captured too. So keep in mind why the Indians so quickly perished has to do with this. First, they're going up against the military, which is using cannons and modern warfare, and the natives fought well. I mean, as I showed you, particularly at Bighorn, a little Bighorn. The problem was Americans would only really lose when some arrogant general would underestimate the Indian resolve. But the railroad particularly wiped out not only the buffalo, but also it kept bringing homesteaders. It kept bringing settlers who would expand on their land even further. These natives were still not resistant to disease as well. And the alcohol they were sold was extremely high alcohol proof. It was very heavy alcohol, so to speak. And unfortunately, and this is really one of the real tragedies of history, the Native American seems to be more susceptible to alcoholism. Now, it kind of makes sense. They would be depressed, and they had not been alcohol drinkers before. But there will become a stereotype during this period of the drunken Indian, because so many Native Americans are going to succumb to alcoholism. But I think about what their life must have been like. They were completely dependent on the federal government. They're not allowed to live the way they did ancestrally, which was the great buffalo hunt. They're told to be farmers in western Wyoming, in South Dakota, not particularly farm states, for 160 acres. You needed a couple thousand acres to be successful doing that. But probably the biggest thing would be the fact that they're by the way, this is a pile of buffalo skulls that this fella's sitting on top of here. So they killed the buffalo almost to extinction. I mean, literally, the buffalo became near extinct. They started bringing buffalo back in the 1980s when they were, endangered species kind of thing. They were almost extinct. Okay, so definitely be aware of it. And it's not that the states weren't aware of the deaths of the buffalo, but it definitely happened. I don't know what the buffalo currently are in terms. I don't think so. I think that they've actually been introduced enough to no longer be in Buffalo, University of Buffalo. I type buffalo status on endangered list. They're probably what's called watch lists. Yeah, near threatened. That's what, they've gone from endangered to near threatened. So that means it's slowly. They are slowly coming back to life, so to speak. There's I'm looking over here on this link at Live Science. It says there are about 4,000 of them in population. So that's a whole lot more than at one point it was like down to double digits, 20 or 30. Yeah, I know, right? Like literally, they were, on the verge of extinction. So you got a couple thousand now. That's pretty good. Hard to say how many before in terms of millions, but they were definitely tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. No, it's not a lot, but it's a lot more than I mean. Like I said, it was in not single digits, but just like 20 or 30 left at some point. I can't guess how many hundreds of thousands. I'm sure it was hundreds of thousands, because I just think about the piles I've seen and the number of, So it's pretty remarkable how quickly that happened too. Like, I mean, it was like quick. 50 years they went to become almost extinct. Now, I always like to focus on the people in history who are the iconoclast. You guys remember that word? Iconoclast is spelled like the word icon. All right. And an iconoclast is a person who attacks beliefs or institutions, right? They go against what the sort of prevailing thought is when the prevailing thought is terrible. So the prevailing thought at the time was that, the Native Americans were the enemy. They were the villains, the bad guys. And what whites had done was necessary, and that the Indians shouldn't be sympathized with because they were savages, like they needed to be turned into white people. Well, you had a person, and she reminds me of De las Casas. You may remember De las Casas. He wrote the book about the destruction of the Indians. He was the priest who pointed out the Spanish were slaughtering Indians, right? Well, she wrote a book in 1881. So this is like a reformer. And again, this is during the Reform period, called A Century of Dishonor, going back to George Washington's presidency and cataloging 100 years of abuse of Americans to Native Americans. So she's trying very hard to raise awareness. So her name is Helen Hunt Jackson, and her book is called A Century of Dishonor. And I've got a copy of it back there. It's a good read. It's dated now. When you read it, it's more about like an anthology. It's the purple book in the second shelf, laying sideways. Yeah, it's big. It's really big. But the book that's now my favorite book on the Native American story is called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It's a really good book. It really personalizes this Sioux Wars particularly. So here's Helen Hunt Jackson writing, and she says, among the 300 bands, there is not a one who has not suffered at the hands of the government or settlers. The poorer or more helpless the band, the more certain the outrage against them. Every page, every year of this history is a dark stain, she says. Now, obviously, she's focusing it as she's not going to make a lot of argument about the Native Americans doing bad things to whites. That's not her perspective. So if you have a quote from Helen Hunt Jackson, recognize she's not trying to indict the Indians. She's defending the Indians, so to speak. And unfortunately, in history, people get defensive. But the point is that she says presidents after presidents, and it's true, have appointed commissions, and then they never look at them again. That's the end of it. Like they make a commission, and it goes on a they're going to do a commission on January 6th, and I imagine it'll have some interesting stuff, and then it'll go on a shelf somewhere. People just won't do much about it. And so she's like, we've got to do better than cheating, robbing, and breaking promises. This is what the commission says. So let's read it. This is the government side. The Cheyenne River agent, so that's a federal agent, reports Indians are remarkably peaceful and quiet, and their sanitation is good. They have hundreds of acres of land under cultivation. They cut 900 tons of hay. There were 75 log houses. The agency has 150. Agency farm has 150 acres. There are Protestant and congregational churches there, a regular school, an Episcopal church there too, and they're flourishing, and the pupils are making progress. So if I read that, I'd be like, "That is awesome." And you know what? I have no doubt that this report is accurate. I expect it probably is true, but unfortunately, it's true on a narrow perspective of the Cheyenne River agent, meaning he didn't choose to report to the government the parts that are bad. Right. And obviously he wants the Cheyenne Reservation to be good. So pointing out the tragedy of it would probably not be good for him. And then you see this, I call this speaking truth to power. You understand? When I tell the truth to you guys, it's because I don't want to enable fantasies in your mind. Right. And so unfortunately, when people's jobs require, like if I were to tell Mr. Bowles anything other than what I thought, I would consider myself not being honest. Right? Because that's my duty, I believe. But a lot of people, they're just going to, give you the the sunny side and not look at the dark side. Well, it goes both ways. You know, she's not going to report the evil, so to speak, that Native Americans have done. But, you know, you have to consider perspective, guys, whenever you're reading anything. Okay. So what becomes the American strategy to deal with the Indian question, so to speak? They had tried this before, and I would point out it totally failed because when the Cherokee did what they were supposed to do, they still got run off. But the belief is the only way to help Native Americans, and there was a real policy of wanting to do this, a real attitude of wanting to do this, was to have them assimilate. So that means stop being Indians for all intents and purposes. Cut your hair, remove your feathers, no more war paint, wear white people clothes, learn English, learn about the US government, and become an American that way. Okay, this is called assimilation. Assimilation. And the idea of assimilation is to kill the Indian and save the man. Does that make sense? Like get rid of all, it's like to de-Indianize them. Of course, they couldn't change their skin color, so they always were going to deal with that kind of discrimination regardless. Now, the best example of an assimilationist program was the federally backed Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. One of the real ironies of our community is we have a school in this region named the Carlisle School, right? Does anybody know what the Carlisle School's mascot is? All right, it's the Chiefs, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
It's the Chiefs. And so I'm like, 0 for 2, man. Not only should you not be naming your school Carlisle if you're naming it after this, right? Because this is a shameful period. Like, this isn't good, y'all. I hope you understand that. Like, you know, taking away people's culture and saying you're wrong and immoral to be that way is not how humanity is supposed to work. But that's what you see here, right? And so the Carlisle Chiefs are like, dang. So anyway, and I'm not this PC guy. I just know that that's ugly, what they did there. They wouldn't allow them to keep their Native American language, their religious beliefs. And when I say wouldn't allow, they took kids from their families, brought them to Pennsylvania, and separated them, right? And then taught them this stuff. Now, I will say there was good side to it. They did learn modern medicine. So a lot of these kids became doctors and worked for the Native Americans as like educated, Americanized Native Americans. But it wasn't voluntarily. It wasn't a choice. This was like, this is what your people must do. And then you need to write down what the Dawes Severalty Act did. So not only was its goal an assimilation policy, it outlawed tribal identity. So the word sever, right? You see that in it? In this case, the Dawes Severalty Act is an attempt to de-Indianize the people. You can no longer identify yourself as a tribe. The good news is you got 160 acres of land, right? I've shown you that already. And if you took care of it, in 25 years, you became a citizen. A citizen, which technically Native Americans were not citizens, even though they were born in America. Think about the 14th Amendment. Yeah, they were the first citizens, right, so to speak. But nonetheless, this Dawes Severalty Act was designed to, well, turn them into white homesteaders for all intents and purposes, and Americans. And so I want you to understand the people who did this stuff right here were very well intended. Like they weren't trying to hurt Indians here. They thought they were doing the right things to Indians. Okay? The problem is that it's imperialistic. It's the type of behavior that doesn't allow a grown-up to decide what kind of life they're going to live. So, you know, it's ultimately, though, for the Native Americans, if you want to look at it from a Machiavellian perspective, you either did this or you weren't going to survive. You understand? So I would know the Dawes Act and I would know the Carlisle School. So yeah, it brings us to our last major event. Now, one of the things that happened under the Dawes Act was it outlawed religious groups gathering that were Native American. They weren't allowed to have rituals that were non-Christian. Well, these aren't citizens, so they don't get freedom of religion. Yeah, right. Plus, it also was designed to remember the tribal component. So this thing was not supposed to be a tribal unification practice. This thing called the ghost dance. Now, it involves several things that white people didn't like. First of all, they usually got high. They took peyote, all right, which was a type of hallucinogenic drug as part of their spirit walk. Okay. Then they had this leader, Wovoka, who preached that the dead would rise, right? And their spirits would fight on the side of the Indians, and they would these spirit warriors would force the whites off their lands. Okay, and then that would bring about like a utopia in the Dakotas. Now the whites have been pouring in the Dakotas, remember, because of the gold rush, and so these are actually folks on the reservation. Now they called it the ghost dance, but because it was outlawed, was the sun dance. So if you've ever heard of the Sundance Film Festival, for example, I don't know if you've ever heard of that. Okay, it's a film festival. It's a great film festival in Aspen, Colorado. But it's named after Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid's actor. Sundance Kid was Robert Redford, right? But the Sundance Kid's name comes from the Sun Dance, which was a Sioux spirit ritual dance. Well, it had been outlawed. So these guys were doing the ghost dance, led by Wovoka. And so a group of American soldiers were ordered to disperse this. Like they went on the reservation and said, you've got to stop doing this. Now keep in mind, these guys are armed. They're allowed to have guns for hunting reasons, right? So that's in the back of your head, right? They got guns there. So when these soldiers arrive at Pine Ridge, right? That's where they came from. That's where the reservation agent was. They ordered the Lakota to disarm. So there's your not having your Second Amendment. So you don't have your First Amendment, you don't have your Second Amendment, right? While that happened, there was an old man who, when the soldiers arrived, started doing the ghost dance, like at protest. One of the men that they tried to take a gun from was deaf, a deaf Native American. So he didn't quite understand what was going on, and he wouldn't give up his gun. All right. When that happened, his gun went off, and then the soldiers started shooting the Indians. Okay. Some of the warriors fought back, but most of them had already lost their guns. And so you saw here somewhere between 250 and 300 people get killed at Wounded Knee. Another 47 children and women wounded. 31 American soldiers died. 39 were wounded. So this is a terrible moment. It was unnecessary. This is what happens when armed people get disarmed by other armed people, right? The chief the chief of the group that was there is killed. He's shot. He was not armed. Spotted elk. And here are their bodies in a pit of the people that were killed. So this is considered the last major event of the Sioux Wars. 1890 is the end of the Indian Wars for all intents and purposes. Because after this, you've either been like by this point, Sitting Bull has surrendered, Geronimo has surrendered, Red Cloud has surrendered. All the chiefs have surrendered and are on the reservation. And this has effectively disarmed the Sioux finally, like formally. So with that, you have sort of the end of the Indian Wars, okay? And you have the creation of the Indian reservation system. Now today, the federal government is doing a lot more to recognize the historic role of Native Americans. So you see lots of federal reservations. That is a wonderful thing for an Indian tribe. If you can have a federal identity, meaning be recognized by the federal government as an official tribe, then your land is free from taxes from the state. The state law does not apply anymore. And so what we mostly think about that probably is where reservations are, right? Is where casinos are. You understand? So if this is the thing, most states do not allow casino gambling. Nevada being the major exception, in New Jersey, right? We've changed too here in Virginia, as you guys are well aware now. And I think part of the reason is that in a lot of these places, including Cherokee, which is down here, there's Cherokee, up here in New England, and all throughout the West are casinos. Because the Indians have found, well, that's actually a way we can make money because the state doesn't let casinos happen, but people will come onto the reservation and play poker, cards, or whatever. You understand? So that's one thing, although it certainly is by no means safe. By the way, if you're making a note, the highest rate of illiteracy in America on the reservation, highest rate of alcoholism on the reservation, highest rate of poverty, Native Americans. So, that's the group that's worst off still in our country. But we're making progress. Now, here in Virginia, we only have one federally recognized tribe. That means a tribe that exists that is federal, and that is called the Pamunkey. That's the folks down in Norfolk area. But Virginia has recognized all of these tribes as official Native Americans. You understand? And that means they get special, better treatment than they historically have gotten. We'll put it that way. So we have improved, and I think that's part of the lesson of history is that today America is conscientious of what our past has been towards Native Americans. We don't shy away from this as much. And when people talk about political correctness with sports teams, I'm like, well, you're being selfish. Because what you're saying is that my interest in entertainment is more important than the identity of a group of people. Now, what's interesting to me is if you think about it, this is the same, this is right down the road from Mount Rushmore. Like Mount Rushmore is just over the hill, literally. And this is the ongoing monument to Crazy Horse, one of the Sioux. He was our meaning the United States enemy, and now there's a huge monument to him, right? And perhaps most noteworthy, we have in Washington, D.C., the National Museum of the American Indian, which is a Smithsonian. So when I'm there, the last time I was there with my children, we ate Native American food. It's prepared there, and that's all that's served in their restaurant kind of thing, Not all that's served, but they have recognition of the role of Native Americans throughout American history, particularly in warfare. They show ceremonial practices, and Native Americans have been allowed to, first of all, the Dawes Act is going to get repealed in history. Let me go ahead and tell you that. Then there will be a second Dawes Act, only it won't be named that, all right? And then that will be a repeal. So since the 1960s, Indians have been allowed to identify as Indians by Native American, by ethnicity. But that's only since the 60s. For much of American history, you had to identify as either black or white if you were an Indian. Well, they're neither. But what I'm saying is like the identity of being a Native American was eliminated. And what's interesting too is a good number of Native Americans are black or African American Native Americans, because you remember the Seminoles? You've heard of the Seminoles. I tried to teach you guys about the Seminoles are a tribe that was created between runaway slaves and Native Americans. So lots of black folks that are Native American. Make sense? Okay, well, we're going to stop with that. Tomorrow we'll take up the folks that settled there. Okay, miners and homesteaders and the various groups like that. But we'll stop today with the Native American story. And there's some wonderful videos and movies.